The letter hit the table like a slap. Mabel's father didn't even look at her when he read it aloud. He just laughed, that low, ugly laugh she had heard her whole life, and slid the paper across the wood like it was something dirty. "Colton Vane wants to marry you," he said. "You the way a man says mistake. The richest rancher in the mountains. Wants you." Her sisters erupted. One covered her mouth. One didn't bother. "He must be blind," Clara said, not quietly enough. Their father leaned back in his chair and looked at Mabel the way he always had, like she was a problem the world had forgotten to solve. "Pack your things," he said. "We're not turning this down." He wasn't giving her away in marriage. He was throwing her out. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever been the one everyone underestimated, subscribe to this channel and follow Mabel's story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning the letter arrived, Mabel Whitmore was already awake. She had been awake since before the sun came up, the way she always was, because the house didn't run itself, and nobody else in the Whitmore family seemed to understand that. The fire needed starting. The water needed hauling. The bread needed to be in the oven before her father's boots hit the floor, or the whole day started wrong. And when the day started wrong in the Whitmore house, Mabel was always the one who paid for it. She was 31 years old. She had been paying for things her whole life. The frontier town of Duskwater sat at the edge of the high country, where the wind came off the mountain ridges every morning like a reminder that this land didn't care about you, didn't owe you anything, and would outlast every single person foolish enough to try to build a life on it. Mabel had grown up in that wind. She knew how to read it. She knew how to lean into it without falling. That was more than she could say for her family. The Whitmore house was a decent size for a frontier property, 4 rooms, a proper kitchen, a covered porch that her father was proud of even though he'd never built a day in his life. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, was the kind of man who talked about what he deserved, while other people did the work of earning it. He had a good name in Duskwater, a name that opened doors and started conversations, and he treated that name like it was money in a bank he'd never actually deposited into. Her sisters were his trophies. Clara was 24 and beautiful the way a fresh painted fence is beautiful, striking from a distance, not much underneath. She had their mother's cheekbones and their father's talent for making everything about herself. Delia's was 22, softer than Clara but meaner when she wanted to be, the kind of pretty that knew exactly what it was worth and invoiced accordingly. Then there was Mabel. Mabel had her father's broad shoulders and her grandmother's wide hands, hands that could wring out a wet blanket or grip a fence post without thinking twice. She was heavy-set in the way that working women on the frontier often were solid, capable, built for actual life rather than the idea of it. She had dark brown eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that stayed quiet when it probably should have spoken, and spoke plainly when everyone expected it to stay quiet. She wasn't what anyone in Duskwater would call a beauty. She knew that. She had always known that. What she hadn't always known was how much her own family agreed. She found out early, the way children always find out the things that mark them not in one terrible moment but in 100 small ones. The way her father's eyes slid past her at the supper table. The way Clara borrowed her good shawl without asking, and then lost it, and never apologized. The way her father introduced her sisters to the men who came calling, and let Mabel stand slightly behind them, slightly apart, like a piece of furniture he wasn't sure where to put. By the time she was 15, she had stopped expecting to be included. By the time she was 20, she had stopped expecting to be seen. She made herself useful instead. Useful was a kind of armor. If she kept the house running, if she kept the accounts straight, if she kept her father's moods from boiling over into something everyone else had to live with, then she had a reason to be there. Purpose. She built her life out of purpose the way other people built it out of hope, and she told herself it was enough. Most days she almost believed it. The letter came on a Tuesday in late October, when the first real cold of the season had settled in and the morning sky had that gray, flat look that meant the mountain passes would be closing soon. Mabel had just come in from feeding the horses when she heard her father's voice, sharp, surprised, and then shifting into something she didn't immediately recognize. Amusement. "Well," he said, and his voice carried through the wall into the kitchen where Mabel was hanging up her coat. "Well, I'll be." She heard Clara say, "What is it, Papa?" In that particular tone she used when she thought something interesting was about to happen and wanted to make sure she was at the center of it. A letter from Raven Ridge. Mabel went still. Everyone in Duskwater knew Raven Ridge. It wasn't just a ranch, it was the ranch. The kind of operation that other ranchers talked about with a mixture of admiration and despair, because it represented a scale of success that most of them would spend their whole lives chasing and never reach. Thousands of acres, thousands of head of cattle, a main house that people called a house but was really something close to a proper building, with glass windows and a stone foundation and a bunkhouse for 40 men. Colton Vane owned all of it. She had seen him exactly once, 2 years earlier, at the harvest market in Milford. He was tall, with a serious face, and the kind of stillness that came from a man who was used to making decisions and living with them. He had looked right past her, the way men like him tended to look past women like her, and she had gone home and not thought about him again, or told herself she hadn't. "Who's the letter from?" Delia asked. "Colton Vane himself," her father said. "Personal letter." Well, he cleared his throat with the sound of a man recalibrating his entire understanding of the morning. "He's looking to marry." There was a brief electric silence. Then Clara made a sound like a cat who had just spotted something interesting. Mabel pulled her coat back off the hook and held it in her hands without putting it on. She didn't know why. Her hands needed something to hold. She heard her father's chair scrape back. She heard him walk to the kitchen doorway. She turned and found him standing there with the letter in his hand, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not exactly. It was the look of a man who had just realized he had something he hadn't known he had. "Mabel," he said. She waited. "The man is asking about you." The silence that followed was one of the loudest things she had ever heard. Her father read from the letter while she stood there with her coat in her hands. Colton Vane's words were formal but plain, the way frontier men often wrote, not fancy, not flowery, just honest and to the point. He said he had been searching for a wife for 3 years. He said he had been particular about what he was looking for and had not found it in any of the women who had been brought to his attention through the usual channels. He said he had reason to believe that Mabel Whitmore of Duskwater was a woman of genuine character and uncommon good sense, and he would like the opportunity to meet her with the intention of a proper courtship and, if they suited, marriage. Her father finished reading. Her sisters looked at each other. Then Clara laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh or even a mean laugh exactly. It was a helpless laugh, the kind that comes out when something strikes you as so absurd that you can't help yourself, and it was worse for that. Delia pressed her hand over her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. "He must have gotten the names mixed up," Delia said. "He must have," Clara agreed, recovering herself. "Papa, you should write back and tell him there's been an error." Probably meant, "He wrote the name very clearly," her father said. He looked at the letter again, and then at Mabel, and Mabel could see him running calculations. She had always been able to read her father's calculations. He was a man of appetites and practicalities. And right now, both of those things were looking at Colton Vane's name and the land attached to it. Mabel Elaine Whitmore. That's what he wrote. The kitchen went quiet in a different way. Mabel set her coat down on the counter. She smoothed her hands flat against the fabric. "I'll write back," her father said finally. "Accept his invitation for a visit. Let him see what he's getting and decide from there." He looked at Mabel with the particular brand of appraisal he reserved for horses he was thinking of selling. "Try to do something with your hair." He walked back into the sitting room. Mabel stood in the kitchen and listened to her sisters murmuring to each other, "Poor man. He'll take one look and run. You know how Papa is. He'll milk this for all it's worth before it falls apart, and she didn't move for a long time. She had spent her whole life being something her family considered a problem to manage, a weight to carry, an embarrassment they dressed up in practicality, so they didn't have to feel bad about it. She had learned to live inside their estimation of her, the way a person learns to live inside, a house with a low ceiling, carefully, hunched, always a little smaller than she actually was. But something happened in that kitchen on that Tuesday morning that she hadn't expected. She got angry. Not the hot, wet kind of anger that burns itself out fast. The other kind. The kind that settles in behind your breastbone and stays there, quiet and solid. The kind that doesn't need to shout because it knows exactly what it is. She was angry at the laughter. She was angry at poor man. He'll take one look. She was angry at 31 years of coat hooks and quiet corners and being introduced slightly behind and slightly apart. She was angry at herself, too, for letting it go on so long without saying a word. She picked her coat back up. She put it on, and she made a decision. She would go to Raven Ridge. She would go not because her father had decided it was worth his while, and not because Colton Vane had written a letter, and not because her sisters had laughed. She would go because she was done waiting for someone else to decide what her life was going to look like. She had been useful her whole life. Maybe it was time to find out what she was worth. The week before she left was strange and uncomfortable in the specific way that things are when a family isn't sure how to feel about something and decides to feel superior instead. Clara offered to lend her a dress, one of her nicer ones, she said, with a kind of nauseating generosity, as though the gesture made up for 20 years. Delia suggested she try pinning her hair up differently, the way the women in the magazines from back east did it, because first impressions mattered, didn't they? And Mabel's first impression had always been well. She didn't finish the sentence. Mabel declined the dress. She had her own clothes. They weren't fancy, but they were clean and well made, and she had made most of them herself, which meant they fit her actual body rather than the body her sisters thought she should have. She packed them herself, without help, and she carried her own trunk to the wagon when the morning came. Her father saw her off with a handshake and a piece of advice she didn't ask for. "Don't talk too much," he said. "Men like Vane, they want a woman who knows when to be quiet." She looked at him. "You've been telling me that my whole life," she said. "I've been quiet. Didn't seem to make you respect me anymore." She climbed up onto the wagon seat before he could answer. The road to Raven Ridge took most of a day, winding up out of the valley through a stretch of open country, where the grass had gone gold with the season, and the sky seemed bigger somehow, wider, like it had room for things that the valley didn't. Mabel sat up on the wagon seat and watched the land go by, and tried not to think about what was waiting at the end of the road. She thought about it anyway. She thought about a man who had written her name in a letter, with what sounded like intention, like he'd meant to write it, like he'd thought about it before he put pen to paper. She thought about genuine character and uncommon good sense, and the fact that nobody in her family had ever described her that way, had never looked at her and seen something worth naming. She thought about what it meant that a stranger had seen it when the people who were supposed to love her hadn't. That thought sat in her chest the whole ride up, and it hurt in the way that true things sometimes do. Raven Ridge Ranch came into view in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the light was the color of old brass. Bigger than she'd imagined, not just the main house, but the whole spread of it, the outbuildings, and the paddocks and the long line of the bunkhouse along the southern edge. Working men moved in the distance. Cattle dotted the hillsides. Everything about it spoke of the kind of quiet, sustained effort that only looks effortless to people who've never done it. She took a breath. The wagon rolled through the gate. A man was standing on the porch of the main house, tall the way she remembered, with a serious face and those same still eyes. He watched her come in, without moving, without waving, without any of the performance she might have expected from a man presenting himself for inspection. He was just watching, like he was making sure she was real. She climbed down from the wagon on her own. She didn't wait for the driver to help her. had never much liked being helped when she could manage it herself, and she stood in the yard and looked at Colton Vane, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "Mr. Vane." He came down off the porch and extended his hand, and she shook it, and his grip was firm, but not the showing-off kind. He looked at her, not with disappointment, not with the recalibrating expression she had been braced for, not with the particular cruelty of a man, realizing he has made a mistake and being too polite to say so. He just looked at her. "You came," he said, like it actually meant something to him. "I said I would." He nodded. "I know. I just—" He stopped. Something passed across his face that she couldn't quite name. "I wasn't sure you would," she studied him. "Were you worried I'd say no?" "I was worried your family might talk you out of it." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The fact that she was standing here, in the yard of Raven Ridge Ranch with her own trunk and her own clothes and a decision she had made herself, was answer enough. He seemed to understand that. "Come inside," he said. "You've had a long ride. We'll eat and talk, and you can tell me whatever you want me to know." Picked up her traveling bag. "Mr. Vane," she said, turned. "I don't know why you wrote that letter. I don't know what you think you saw or what you think you know about me, but I'm here because I decided to come, not because my family sent me." She met his eyes. "I want you to know that from the start." He held her gaze for a moment. "Good," he said quietly. "I wouldn't have wanted it any other way." Followed him inside, and the door to her old life swung shut behind her without so much as a sound. First night at Raven Ridge, Mabel didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual for her. She had never been a good sleeper, had always been the kind of person whose mind kept running long after her body had given up, turning things over and over the way water turns stones slowly, persistently, without any particular destination. But that night, the not sleeping had a different quality to it. It wasn't the anxious, circular kind she was used to, the kind that looped back through old grievances and settled arguments. It was something closer to alertness, like a part of her that had been dormant for a long time had suddenly decided to wake up and pay attention. The room she'd been given was at the back of the main house, small but clean, with a real window that looked out over the eastern pasture. Someone had put a quilt on the bed, not a fancy one, but well made, the kind of quilt that had been washed so many times it had gone soft all the way through. There was a pitcher of water on the stand and a candle on the table and nothing else which she preferred. She had never liked rooms full of things. She lay on top of the quilt with her boots off and her dress still on and stared at the ceiling and thought about Colton Vane. Dinner had been simple roasted meat, boiled potatoes, a pot of coffee that had been on the fire, long enough to strip the inside of a boot, and they had eaten mostly in silence, which she had appreciated more than she expected to. She had braced herself for the performance of a man trying to impress her, or worse, the performance of a man being polite while he regretted his decision. She had gotten neither. Colton had eaten his food and asked her 2 questions, and listened to her answers in a way that suggested he was actually listening, not just waiting for her to stop talking so he could say what he'd already decided to say. The first question was whether the road had been rough. She said it had been rougher in spring when the creek crossings were up, but she'd managed. The second question was what she knew about cattle operations. She looked at him across the table. "Why?" "Because that's the work here," he said. "I want to know where you're starting from." She told him she knew the basics: breeding cycles, winter feeding, the signs of common illnesses, how to read the condition of a herd by looking at their coats and the way they moved. She told him she'd helped manage her family's small operation for 10 years, and that she'd made most of the decisions, even when her father pretended he'd made them himself. Colton had set down his fork at that and looked at her for a moment. "That's more than most," he said, and then he went back to eating. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like a notation, something filed away, confirmed, moved on from. She found she liked that better than a compliment would have been. But it was what happened after dinner that she kept turning over in the dark. He had walked her to the door of the back hallway where her room was, and he had stopped at the threshold The way a man stops when he's about to say something he's been holding back. She had waited. She was good at waiting. "I should tell you something," he said, "before you make any decisions." "All right. This isn't a romantic arrangement." He said it plainly. The way he said everything, no apology in it. No embarrassment, just a man stating a fact so that a woman could deal with it clearly. I'm not built for that kind of thing. What I need is a partner. Someone who can run this place alongside me and make decisions I can trust. If that's not what you came here for, I'd rather know now than after." She had looked at him for a long time. "What happened?" she asked. Something moved across his face. "To what?" "To the romantic part. Something happened to it." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife," he said, 3 years ago. Fever took her in November. He didn't look away when he said it, which she respected. We were married 7 years. She ran this place as much as I did. When she died, the ranch nearly died with her, because I didn't know how much she'd been holding up." He paused. "I'm not looking to replace her. I want you to know that too." Mabel stood in that doorway and felt something she hadn't expected, which was that his honesty cost him something, and he gave it anyway. "I didn't come here looking for romance either," she said. "I came here looking to find out what I'm capable of when someone actually lets me try." He had nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he'd suspected. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll show you the operation tomorrow." And that was that. She lay in the dark now and thought about a man who had loved someone enough that losing her had taken something structural out of him, something load-bearing, and who had spent 3 years trying to figure out how to rebuild without it. Thought about the fact that he had told her that before anything else, before pleasantries, before any attempt to make himself seem better than he was. She thought that was either the most honest thing a man had ever said to her or the saddest. She fell asleep somewhere before dawn and woke to the sound of the ranch coming alive outside the window. The Raven Ridge operation in full daylight was something she hadn't been prepared for, even after everything she'd heard about it. She had understood it intellectually, the scale, the numbers, the acres, but understanding something in numbers and standing in the middle of it while men moved in all directions, and cattle filled the hillsides and the smell of hay and horses and cold morning air hit. You all at once were two entirely different things. Colton was already in the yard when she came out. He handed her a cup of coffee without comment, better than the previous nights, she noticed, which meant someone had made a fresh pot and started walking, expecting her to follow. She followed. He showed her the cattle operation first, 4,000 head across 3 different pasture rotations, with a system for moving them that he'd worked out over 15 years. And that depended on weather, grass condition, water availability, and about 40 other variables that he explained quickly and without condescension, as though he assumed she was capable of keeping up. She kept up. She asked 3 questions, and he answered all of them without making her feel like she should have known the answers already. They were standing at the fence line of the main pasture when Walt Greer found them. Walt was the ranch foreman, a compact, weathered man in his 50s with a face like worked leather, and the kind of eyes that had been making judgments about people for so long that he'd stopped being polite about it. He came up to the fence with his hat in his hands and looked at Mabel the way she had been looked at her entire life, which was to say he looked at her and then looked at Colton as though she might not be there. "Need a word," Walt said to Colton. "You can say it in front of Miss Whitmore." Walt's jaw shifted. "Henderson Creek's running low again. Started yesterday. If it drops another foot, we're going to have trouble getting water to the south of pasture before the freeze." Colton's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened. "How low?" "Real low. Gareth says it might be upstream. Could be the Aldrich operation diverting again." The name landed in the air and sat there. Colton looked at the pasture for a moment. "I'll ride up this afternoon," he said. "Gareth, watch it." Walt nodded. He started to turn away and then stopped, like he'd remembered something unpleasant. He looked at Mabel again, directly this time, fully, in a way that was meant to be read. "Didn't expect company," he said to Colton. "No, Colton agreed mildly. You didn't. Another pause. Then Walt put his hat back on and walked away without another word. Mabel watched him go. He doesn't like me. Walt doesn't like change, Colton said. He'll get over it or he won't. Either way, it's his problem. He turned back toward the main house. Come on. I want to show you the books. The books were kept in a small room off the main parlor that Colton used as an office ledgers, supply orders, livestock records, water rights documentation. A pile of correspondence that had the look of things that had been sitting there for longer than they should have. Mabel sat across from him at the desk, and he walked her through the financial picture of Raven Ridge with the same matter-of-fact directness he'd brought to everything else. And what the financial picture showed was this. The ranch was successful, by most standards, but it was carrying more risk than it looked like from the outside. The margins were thinner than they should have been for an operation this size. 3 years of running, shorthanded in the management, had cost real money in small inefficiencies, and small inefficiencies had a way of compounding. She looked at a supply ledger from the previous spring and found an overpayment on feedstock that amounted to about 2 months' wages for a working hand. Did you catch this? She asked, pointing. He leaned over and looked. A muscle in his jaw tightened. No. The supplier billed you for premium grade on a standard order. It's the same thing, 3 months running. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the page for a moment with an expression that was doing its best to stay neutral. 3 months at least. I'd checked the previous year too. He rubbed the back of his neck. It was the first unguarded gesture she'd seen from him, the kind of thing a man does when he's frustrated and doesn't quite want to show it. I've been running this ranch for 15 years, he said. I know. And a woman who's been here one morning is finding errors in my accounts. Would you rather I hadn't told you? He looked at her. No, he said. No, I would not. He pushed the ledger toward her. Look at the rest. She spent the next 2 hours going through 3 years of records while he sat across from her and answered questions and didn't once make her feel like she was overstepping. What she found wasn't catastrophic, but it was significant, not fraud exactly. More like the accumulated result of an operation that had lost one of the people who'd been paying close attention and had been running on momentum and grit since then, without anyone noticing the slow erosion underneath. When she'd worked through the last ledger, she sat back and looked at him. You need someone watching the supplier relationships, she said, and the water rights situation with Aldrich needs to be documented properly. If they're diverting and you don't have the records in order, you'll lose any legal claim before you can make it. It was quiet for a moment. Outside, the ranch sounds went on men's voices, horses, the distant low of cattle from the hillside. You learned all this from running a small operation in Duskwater, he said. I learned most of it from making mistakes on a small operation in Duskwater and then figuring out what went wrong. She paused. And from reading everything I could get my hands on, which wasn't as much as I would have liked. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, he was not a man who showed things easily, but something. I have books, he said, in the parlor, legal texts, land management. You can read whatever you want. She nodded. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. The days that followed had a shape she hadn't expected. She had thought there would be more awkwardness, more of the performance of two strangers, trying to figure out what they were supposed to be to each other. What there was instead was work. There was always work at Raven Ridge, the kind of work that didn't pause for social discomfort or uncertainty, and the work had its own rhythm that they fell into without talking about it much. She spent her mornings in the office working through the accounts and correspondence. She spent her afternoons outside, learning the land and the cattle and the way the operation actually functioned, as opposed to how it looked on paper, which were two different things, as they always were. She ate dinner with Colton every evening, and they talked about the ranch, and sometimes about other things, the history of the high country, the politics of the water rights disputes that had been simmering in the region for years, books she'd found in the parlor about soil management that she'd read half of in 2 evenings. He was not an easy man to talk to, He was precise and sparse with words, and he had a habit of going quiet at unexpected moments, not rudely, just fully like a door closing. She learned to let the quiet sit without trying to fill it, which was different from how she'd handled silence in her family's house, where silence was always a warning. On the fourth day, Walt Greer made his move. She came out to the south pasture in the afternoon to check on the water level at Henderson Creek. Colton was riding the upper pastures and had asked her to take a look and found Walt there already, leaning against a fence post with two of the other hands standing slightly behind him. She walked up to the creek bank and crouched down to look at the water level. It was low, visibly significantly low. "You measuring it?" Walt asked. "Trying to." She looked upstream. "It's being diverted somewhere above the bend." "Uh-huh." He was quiet for a moment. "You know much about water rights?" "Enough, because this situation with Aldrich has been going on for 3 years, and it's not something you can just read in a ledger and fix." She stood up and turned to look at him. "I didn't say it was." "No, but you're walking around this place acting like you own it, and you don't." He kept his voice flat, not aggressive exactly, just blunt in a way that was clearly intentional. "You're not married yet. You're not anything yet. And Mr. Vane has a way of taking people at their word before he ought to." Two hands behind him weren't quite looking at her. They were doing the thing where men let another man speak for them so they can pretend they have clean hands. Mabel looked at Walt steadily. "Are you loyal to this ranch?" He blinked. "What?" "It's a simple question. Are you loyal to Raven Ridge?" 15 years I've been here. You're asking me. Then whoever helps this ranch succeed is on your side," she said. "And whoever doesn't isn't. I don't care which one you decide I am. That's your business. But while you're deciding, Henderson Creek is dropping, and Aldrich is probably laughing." She turned back to the water. "I'm going to walk upstream and find where the diversion is. You can come with me or not." She didn't look back to see if he followed. They found it about a quarter-mile upstream, a temporary dam of rocks and timber, clearly new, cutting across a tributary that fed directly into Henderson Creek. Someone had built it fast and recently, and built it well enough to make a measurable difference in the flow downstream. Walt stood and looked at it for a long moment. "That's Aldrich's work," he said. "I know. They've done it before, but never this far onto the boundary." She was already studying the construction, noting the placement of the timber, the way the rocks had been seated. "How long does it take to tear this down?" "Hour, maybe less with enough hands." "And how long does it take Aldrich to claim we damaged their property if we do it without documentation?" Walt looked at her. "We need a witness," she said. "Someone from town. A surveyor or an official who can confirm the location relative to the property line before we take it apart." She looked at him. "Can you get someone from Duskwater out here by tomorrow morning?" He worked his jaw for a moment. "County surveyor owes Colton a favor. Then call it in." He didn't answer immediately. She gave him the space to not answer, which was harder than it sounded. "I'll ride in tonight," he said finally. She nodded. She didn't say thank you. She had the sense that Walt Greer didn't want her thanks, didn't want any acknowledgement that he'd done anything she'd suggested. So she just nodded and turned toward the ranch, and they walked back in a silence that was different from the earlier one. That evening, she told Colton what found and what she'd arranged. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened. When she finished, he said, "Walt agreed to this. Walt is riding to Duskwater tonight." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she was starting to be able to read. Not quite something else, something in between. "Walt doesn't ride to Duskwater for anyone," he said. Started to say something, and then stopped. She thought about Walt, walking behind her upstream, following a woman he didn't want to respect because the ranch needed it, and he loved the ranch more than he loved his own stubbornness. Thought that was worth something. "He does for Raven Ridge," she said. The county surveyor arrived the following morning, a thin man named Hobson who wore an impractical hat and carried his equipment in an oilskin case and seemed deeply displeased about being there until he saw the diversion and understood what he was looking at. He measured. He documented. He signed his name to a record that placed the diversion approximately 40 yards inside the Raven Ridge boundary, which was not close, which was not something that could be argued as accidental. Took the dam apart while Hobson was still there, which was Walt's idea, and she gave him credit for it in her own mind. By afternoon, the water level at Henderson Creek was already beginning to recover. Standing at the fence line, watching the water rise, Walt came up beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. She waited. "You knew he'd come if I asked," Walt said. "Hobson, I figured there was a good chance. You could have gone around me, gone straight to Colton." "Yes. Why didn't you?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you know this ranch better than I do," she said, "and I needed you to know I know that." Walt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the water. "Fair enough," he said. It was not exactly an apology. It was not exactly an acceptance. It was something in between, which was probably all she was going to get from Walt Greer for a while, and she decided it was enough to work with. What she didn't see, and what Walt didn't see, was that Colton had been standing about 30 yards back, watching the whole thing from the shadow of the barn. She only found out later, when he mentioned it at dinner, as though it were a minor detail. "You could have told me you were watching," she said. "Could have," he agreed. She looked at him and picked up his fork, "and I wanted to see what you'd do on your own." She felt a flicker of irritation, and then something else, something that sat under the irritation and was harder to name. Not quite pride, not quite anything she had a word for. "Did you get a good look?" she said. "I did." He ate for a moment. "You were right about going through Walt instead of around him. I wouldn't have thought of it. You wouldn't have needed to. It's your ranch. They already trust you." "That's the point," he said. "It's not enough for them to trust me. For this place to work, they need to trust the person working alongside me." She set down her fork. There was something in what he'd just said that landed differently than she expected. Not the words themselves, but the working alongside me, part the way he said it, without hesitation, without qualification, like it was already settled. Thought about her father's house. She thought about the accounts she'd managed that her father called his decisions. She thought about 31 years of working alongside someone who never once named it that. "You actually believe that," she said, "that it has to be equal. It doesn't work any other way," he said. "I know because I tried every other way." She looked at him across the table. "Tell me about her," she said. He went still for just a moment. "Ruth, if you want to." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not. Then he said, "She was practical. Blunter than me, which I didn't think was possible. She grew up on a ranch and knew more about cattle medicine than most of the hands. When she died," he stopped, started again. "When she died, I kept finding things she'd fixed that I hadn't known were broken. A water line she'd rerouted. A supplier she'd quietly stopped using because he was dishonest. A hand she'd counseled out of a drinking problem that would have cost us a good man." He paused. "I didn't know the half of what she was doing. That's what made it so bad." Mabel looked at the table. "She sounds like she was extraordinary." She was. He met her eyes. "I'm not looking for her in you. I want you to know that. I know. I mean it. She was who she was, and you're someone entirely different. And that's—" He seemed to search for the word. "Fine. That's how it should be." She nodded, believed him, which surprised her because she had been waiting for the comparison without realizing it, braced for the moment when she would inevitably be measured against a dead woman and found lacking. But the way he said it plainly, without sentiment, like a man who had done the hard work of sorting his grief into something he could live next to the way he said it, made her think he actually meant it. She picked up her fork again. "The Aldrich situation isn't finished," she said. "The documentation Hobson filed is good for the immediate dispute. But if they're doing this now, in October, before the freeze, they'll do it again in spring when it matters more. We should file a formal water rights claim before the county records close for winter." He looked at her for a second. Then he almost smiled, not quite, but nearly, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that she suspected was what smiling looked like on Colton Vane. "I'll get the papers from the county office. he said. I'll draft the claim. You know how? I read 2 of your legal texts last week. He looked at her. I'll check your draft, he said. Obviously, she said. They went back to eating, and the fire crackled in the hearth, and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds outside. And Mabel sat at the dinner table of a man she was not in love with, and thought that this was the closest she had ever come to, feeling like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It didn't feel the way she thought it would. It didn't feel the way the stories said. Felt instead like something solid underfoot after a long time of uncertain ground. Not exciting, not perfect, just real. Something built. Something that could hold weight. Finished her coffee and said goodnight and walked down the hallway to her room. And this time when she lay down on the quilt with the eastern window going dark, she fell asleep in under an hour. Outside, the creek ran steadily in the dark, the water climbing back toward its proper level, filling in what had been taken. The water rights claim was filed on a Thursday, 12 days after Mabel arrived at Raven Ridge, and the county clerk in Duskwater accepted it without comment, which was either a good sign or a sign that nobody at the county office had told Harlan Aldrich yet. Colton said it was probably the second one. He was right. By the following Monday, a writer came up from the valley with a letter from Aldrich's attorney, a man named Pressler, who worked out of a proper office in the territorial capital, and charged enough to make that fact clear in the quality of his stationery. The letter was polite in the way that only genuinely threatening letters are polite, full of phrases like "your attention is respectfully requested," and "we trust this matter can be resolved without further inconvenience." That meant, translated plainly, "We are going to make this very difficult for you." Mabel read it twice at the kitchen table, while Colton stood by the window. "He's claiming prior appropriation," she said. "He's saying Aldrich has been drawing from that tributary for longer than your water rights documentation covers." That's a lie. It's a lie. I know it's a lie, but if his attorney can argue it in front of the county board before we can counter it, they don't need to prove it's true. They just need to create enough uncertainty that the board delays any ruling until spring. She set the letter down. And if they delay until spring and Aldrich diverts again during the melt, we lose a significant portion of the south pasture water before we can stop it legally. Colton said it flatly, without drama, the way he processed bad information, straight through, no circling. We do. It wasn't quite a question. It was the way he talked when he was thinking out loud and expected her to think alongside him, which she had come to recognize as one of the things she valued about him without having a name for it yet. "We need documentation of Aldrich's actual usage history," she said, "not just the diversion last month. Historical records. How long has he been drawing from that tributary? How much? And whether it was ever inside the agreed water allocation for his property." She paused. "That information exists somewhere. County records, old survey maps, possibly the Territorial Land Office. That's a week's worth of work in record rooms. At least." Colton turned from the window. "I can't go. I need to be here for the cattle rotation before the freeze." "I know," she said. "I'll go." He looked at her. "To the territorial capital? The land office is there. The survey records are there." She met his eyes. "Do you have a reason you don't want me to go?" He was quiet for a moment, not the reluctant quiet of a man who doesn't trust her. She knew that quiet by now, knew it was different from this. This was the quiet of a man recalibrating something. "I'll write you a letter of authorization," he said, "so the officials know you're acting on behalf of the ranch. That would help." He nodded. He went to the desk. He wrote the letter without being asked again, and he wrote it in plain language that gave her full authority to access. Rick Barron's mode to negotiate on behalf of Raven Ridge. And he signed it and handed it to her. And that was that. She left 2 days later. The territorial capital was 3 days' ride southeast in the flatlands below the mountain passes where the land opened up, and the towns got bigger and noisier and less interested in you than the frontier settlements were. Mabel had been there once before, years ago, with her father on a supply run that he'd used mainly as an opportunity to conduct business she wasn't supposed to know about. She had spent that trip waiting outside offices and in wagon beds, and had seen almost nothing of the city itself. This time she walked into the territorial land office on her own 2 feet, with Colton's letter in her coat pocket, and asked to speak with whoever managed historical survey records. The man behind the counter looked at her, the way men in official offices always looked at women who came in alone with the particular brand of patience that isn't patience at all, but a performance of it while they wait for you to go away. "Ma'am, these records are—" She put Colton Vane's letter on the counter. He read it. Something in his expression shifted. "I'll get the supervisor," he said. The supervisor was a small, efficient woman in her 40s named Mrs. Harker, who wore her gray hair pulled back and her authority like a second coat, and who looked at Mabel with something closer to professional recognition than anything she'd encountered in that building. Harker pulled the survey records for the Henderson Creek watershed herself and spread them across a table in the back room, and left Mabel alone with them and a lamp. It took Mabel the better part of 2 days. The records were dense and not organized in any way that suggested anyone had looked at them recently, which was both a frustration and, she was beginning to understand, an opportunity. Nobody had looked at them, which meant nobody had found what she found. On the afternoon of the second day, buried in a survey update from 11 years ago, a notation by a territorial surveyor named Beckwith, initialed in faded pencil, that indicated the Henderson Creek tributary had been formally assessed as originating within the Raven Ridge property boundary, and that any downstream use by adjacent properties was contingent on the primary landowner's consent. She read it 3 times. Then she asked Mrs. Harker for paper and copied it down word for word. Harlan Aldrich did not have prior appropriation. He had 11 years of usage that was contingent on consent that had never been formally given and never been formally revoked because nobody had ever found Beckwith's notation in a file that nobody had looked at. She rode back to Raven Ridge with the copy in her coat and the original documented and dated by Mrs. Harker's office, and she arrived on a Friday evening when the sky was doing something extraordinary with the sunset that she noticed, but didn't stop to look at because she was thinking too hard about water rights law. Colton was in the barn when she rode in. He came out when he heard hooves and stood in the yard and watched her dismount, and she could tell from the way he was standing careful, contained that the week had not been easy, and he was not going to say so. "I found something," she said. She told him about Beckwith's notation. She watched his face as she explained it, the stillness, and then something underneath the stillness that moved. "That kills Pressler's argument," he said. "It does more than that. It means Aldrich has been operating on land he doesn't have the water rights to for over a decade. If we file a formal complaint with the territorial board rather than just the county level, he'd lose the South Draw entirely and pay restitution on 11 years of unauthorized usage." She paused. "Depending on how the board calculates it, that's significant." Colton was quiet for a long moment. The barn sounds continued behind him. Horses shifting, a hand moving something in the dark. "You found this in 2 days," he said. "Day and a half." He looked at her. "I've been fighting Aldrich over that creek for 3 years." "You were fighting him over the present." The answer was in the past. She put her hand in her coat pocket and touched the folded paper. "I'm good at old records. I grew up managing the only thing in our house worth managing, and it was never the cattle." He reached out and she handed him the copy. He read it carefully, the way he read everything fully without rushing. When he was done, he folded it and looked up. "We'll send this to a territorial attorney on Monday," he said. "Not Pressler's level, someone who works the land board directly." "I already have a name," she said. "Mrs. Harker recommended someone. A man named Caldwell, who handles water rights exclusively." Something in his expression did the almost smile thing again. "Of course you do. Do you want the name or not?" "Yes," he said. "I want the name." She gave it to him. He wrote it down, and then they went inside, because the November cold had settled hard, and the fire needed to be built up. And Mabel had been in the saddle for 3 days, and was tired in the particular bone-deep way of a person who has been working hard at something that mattered. The shift in the ranch happened gradually, the way real shifts usually do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small moments that, looked at together, add up to something that can't be undone. Walt Greer stopped directing questions past her to Colton, not all at once, and not without the occasional backslide, but steadily, the way a man adjusts when reality keeps insisting on something he was resistant to. The hands noticed, she could tell by the way they looked at her now, which was different from the way they'd looked at her in the first week. Still cautious, some of them, a few openly curious, but no longer as though she were temporary. Gareth, the young hand who monitored Henderson Creek, started leaving his daily water level reports on the kitchen table instead of seeking out Walt, because she'd asked him to, and because he'd figured out she'd actually do something with them. He was 22 in earnest and had grown up in the flatlands and knew a great deal about horses and almost nothing about the business side of anything. And he reminded her a little of the kind of person she might have been if she'd had the luxury of not having to know everything early. She liked him for that, and tried not to show it in a way that would embarrass him. The marriage question had not gone away. It had simply been sitting patiently in the background the way important questions do when there's no immediate pressure on them, waiting for the right moment to come forward. They had been at Raven Ridge together for almost a month when Colton raised it directly, on a Saturday evening when the ranch was quiet and the lamp on the desk was burning low. "We should talk about the arrangement," he said. She closed the ledger she'd been working through. "All right, you've been here a month." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The original understanding was that you'd visit and we'd decide. You've been doing a month's worth of work on a visiting basis." "I'm aware. It's not fair," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something, like he was admitting to a failure of accounting. "If you're going to keep doing what you've been doing, you should have a proper stake in it." She looked at him. "Are you proposing to me?" He met her eyes. "I'm saying the arrangement should be formalized. If you want it to be, that's not the same thing." He set his cup down. "No," he said, "it's not." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm saying I think you should stay. I'm saying I think this." He gestured, a small movement that seemed to include the office, the ranch, the conversation itself. "Think this works. Better than I expected anything to work again." He paused. "And I'm saying, if you want to go back to Duskwater, I'll understand. But I'd rather you didn't." It was not a romantic speech. It was not the kind of thing women in the stories she'd read growing up hoped to hear. It was the statement of a man who was not built for poetry, trying very hard to be honest, and she found it more moving for that, which surprised her. "I don't want to go back to Duskwater," she said. "Then we should get the papers filed. Properly." She nodded. "All right." He picked up his coffee cup again. "End of the month. Hobson can witness it. He owes me twice now." "He does not owe you. He got paid to come out and document that diversion, Mabel. He was going to do it regardless. Then don't phrase it as a favor." "Everything on the frontier is a favor," he said. "That's how it works." She almost laughed. She stopped herself, but he saw it, and the corner of his mouth moved. She went back to the ledger. He went back to his coffee. Outside, the wind was coming off the mountain ridges the way it always did in November, with the particular insistence of something that doesn't need to hurry because it knows you're not going anywhere. The wedding was small and practical, which was the only kind either of them wanted. Hobson witnessed it, looking somewhat less displeased than he usually did. Walt stood in the back of the room with his hat in his hands. Gareth tried to clean his boots and mostly succeeded. There was no celebration beyond a dinner that Mabel cooked herself because she didn't trust anyone else to do it properly, which Colton pointed out was something she should probably learn to let go of. "When someone here can cook without burning the onions," she said, "I'll let go of it." He couldn't argue with that, which she counted as a point in her favor. It was Mabel Vane when November ended. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined marriage would feel. Back when she'd been young enough to imagine it, there was no transformation, no flood of belonging, no moment when everything suddenly became clear. What there was instead was continuity. The work was the same work. The mornings were the same mornings. The office and the ledgers and the cattle reports and the creek levels and the correspondence from Caldwell, the water rights attorney, who was already building a case that was going to take Harlan Aldrich's comfortable sense of entitlement apart, piece by piece. What had changed was something quieter and harder to name. She walked through Raven Ridge differently now. Not with more confidence, exactly, she had arrived with. Confidence, whatever her family thought, but with something more settled beneath it. Like the difference between standing on ground you're borrowing and standing on ground you've earned a right to. It was a Tuesday in early December when she figured out the winter feed problem. The feed situation had been bothering her since her second week, when she'd noticed a pattern in the winter stock reports that Colton's previous system hadn't fully accounted for. The high pastures lost grazing availability faster than the schedules assumed, which meant the hay stores were always running thin in late winter, not catastrophically, but enough that the cattle came through February and March in weaker condition than they should, which affected breeding rates in spring, which affected the calf counts the following fall, which was the kind of cascading problem that's invisible when you're looking at any one year, but obvious when you look at 5 years together. She brought it to Colton on a Tuesday evening with 3 years of feeding records spread out on the desk. He looked at the records. He looked at the pattern she'd marked. "We've been feeding on the same schedule my father used," he said. "I know. The land hasn't changed. Why would the schedule? The herd size has changed," she said. "You've grown the operation by 30% in 10 years. Schedule never adjusted." He sat back in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck, the gesture she'd come to recognize as his version of being genuinely thrown by something. "If we increase the winter hay stores by 20%, she said, and shift the high pasture rotation to pull back 2 weeks earlier in fall, that costs money up front. It saves more in spring. The calf loss rate in March and April is higher than it should be for a herd in good condition. I'd estimate the feed adjustment pays for itself inside 2 years. He looked at the records again. He was quiet for a while, and she let him be quiet, because she knew he was running it through in his mind, not doubting her, just needing to arrive at the same conclusion by his own route, which was how he operated. "How much up front?" he said. She had the number ready. She gave it to him. He nodded. "I'll talk to the supplier." "I already wrote to him," she said. "Before I brought it to you, I wanted to know if the supply was available." "It is." He looked at her. "Sorry," she said. "I should have—" "No," he said. "That's right. That's the right order to do it in." He paused. Stopped. "What?" He seemed to be working something out. "Ruth used to do that. Work the whole thing through before she brought it to me. So I couldn't object on a technicality." Something in his voice was careful, not sad exactly, but careful in the way of a man handling something fragile. "I'm not comparing. I'm just saying it's a good habit." She looked at the desk. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he agreed. They ordered the feed the following week. December settled into the ranch, like a lodger who planned to stay through spring, and Mabel settled with it. And Raven Ridge kept turning on its axis the way it always had, except that it turned slightly more efficiently now, and with slightly less bleeding at the margins, and the men who worked it had quietly adjusted their understanding of who they answered to. When Colton wasn't available, which was Mabel, which nobody said out loud, but everybody knew, Walt Greer, for his part, had arrived at a kind of gruff equilibrium that was probably as close to respect as he was capable of showing someone he hadn't known for 15 years. He asked her opinion on 2 things in December, once about a hand who was underperforming and once about a fence dispute with a neighboring small operation, and he listened to both answers and acted on one of them and partially acted on the other, which she thought was entirely reasonable. She had learned something about Walt in the months she'd been at Raven Ridge, which was that he loved the ranch. We saw some men love their children not tenderly, not with any softness about it, but with the deep, structural loyalty of someone whose whole identity is bound up in the thing's survival. Once she understood that, she understood him. And once she understood him, she stopped needing him to like her. and started just needing him to work alongside her, which he did. It was in the second week of December that Harlan Aldrich came to the ranch himself. She hadn't expected that. Colton hadn't expected it either. She could tell by the way his jaw set when Walt came in to say a rider was at the gate with Aldrich's name. "Tell him to come in," Colton said. She stayed where she was at the desk. He didn't ask her to leave, and she didn't offer. Harlan Aldrich was not what she'd pictured. She had pictured a large, loud man, the frontier version of her father, maybe, the kind of bully who came in big and noisy. What came through the door instead was a man in his 60s, compact and tidy, with a silver mustache and the kind of cold, calculating eyes that were more dangerous than the loud variety because they were always working. He looked at the office. He looked at Colton. He looked at Mabel with the particular attention of a man who had been told something about her and was now assessing how accurate the information was. "Vane," he said. "Aldrich." Colton didn't stand. Mabel noted that and noted it was intentional. "What brings you up?" "Thought we might speak plainly." Aldrich moved to the chair across the desk, Mabel's chair, the one she'd vacated when she stood to acknowledge him, which she now understood she shouldn't have done, man to man without the attorneys making noise. "My wife is party to any conversation about the ranch," Colton said. Aldrich looked at Mabel again. Something shifted in his assessment, not quite respect, not quite anything positive, but a recalculation. "Fine," he said. He settled back in the chair. "The water rights claim is an inconvenience." "Accurate," Mabel said. He looked at her without warmth. "It's an aggressive reading of an old survey notation that nobody's been paying attention to for 11 years, which means in practice it's never mattered. In practice, it's mattered every spring when your operation diverts water that belongs to this property," she said. "The fact that you got away with it doesn't make it legal." Aldrich looked at Colton. "She's going to cost you." "She's already made me money," Colton said. "What do you want?" "I want to negotiate a water-sharing arrangement. Something that keeps both operations running without legal fees eating us both alive." He laid his hands flat on the desk. "I'm prepared to offer a 10-year agreement, fixed allocation, no further disputes." "With what baseline?" Mabel asked. He named a number. She looked at it in her mind, because she'd spent enough time with the survey records and Caldwell's preliminary assessment to know exactly what the allocation breakdown should be. "That number assumes prior appropriation rights that your operation doesn't have," she said. "The corrected baseline is about 30% lower." Aldrich's eyes went cold in a specific way, the way of a man who is used to being the smartest person in a room and has just discovered he is not. "That's not a negotiating position," he said. "That's a demand." "It's an accurate number," she said. "If Caldwell presents Beckwith's notation to the territorial board, that's approximately what they'll award. You can negotiate from that baseline, or you can take your chances with the board." Aldrich looked at Colton. "Your wife is inflexible," he said. "My wife is correct," Colton said. A silence sat in the room for a long moment. Fire crackled. Outside, the December wind moved through the fence posts and made a sound like something trying to get in. Aldrich stood. He picked up his hat from the desk, where he'd set it, and turned it in his hands. "I'll take it to my attorney," he said. "That's your right," Colton said. He left without looking at Mabel again. She listened to his boots cross the porch and the sound of his horse leaving the yard, and then she sat back down in the chair he'd vacated. Colton looked at her. 30% lower, he said. "Approximately. Caldwell will have a more precise figure. He came here thinking he could talk me into something reasonable. He came here thinking he could talk you past me," she said. "He didn't know what I'd found." Colton was quiet for a moment. "He knows now." "Yes." She pulled the ledger back toward her. "He'll go to his attorney, and Pressler will tell him his position is weak. Then he'll either accept the corrected baseline or take it to the board and lose." She paused. "Either way, it's over. You're confident. The survey notation is clear. The law is clear." She met his eyes. "The only variable was whether we found the evidence in time." He did. He looked at her for a long moment, and she felt what she'd come to recognize as his version of something. Not admiration exactly, not in the way men perform it. It was something quieter and more substantial, set. The way he looked at a fence line that had been properly set, or a piece of machinery that worked the way it was supposed to. Recognition. The particular satisfaction of something being exactly what it needed to be. You've changed this place, he said. The place was already good, she said. It just needed someone paying attention to things that were getting past you. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one. He almost smiled again. She had stopped being surprised by how much she liked that almost smile. Caldwell's letter arrived 3 days before Christmas, and it confirmed everything. She'd told Aldrich the territorial board's likely ruling, the corrected allocation figures, the weakness of any prior appropriation argument. It also confirmed something she hadn't mentioned to Colton yet, because she'd wanted to verify it first, that Aldrich's own water rights documentation had a gap in it, a lapsed filing from 8 years ago that had never been corrected, which meant his position was even weaker than she'd represented it. Told Colton over dinner, on a night when it had begun to snow outside, the first real snow of the season, coming down steady and quiet in the darkness beyond the kitchen window. He read Caldwell's letter carefully. He put it down. He's going to settle, Colton said. By January, I think. Pressler will tell him the board is a losing fight, and then it's done, and then it's done. He poured more coffee. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the yard and the paddocks and the long hillsides where 4,000 cattle were settled into their winter routine, fed on hay stores that were, for the first time in years, exactly the right amount for the size of the herd. She had not been at Raven Ridge for 3 months yet. In that time, she had audited 5 years of accounts, identified and corrected supplier fraud, documented an 11-year water rights violation, filed a territorial claim that was about to end a 3-year dispute, restructured the winter feeding program, and quietly become the person the ranch hands brought their problems to when they wanted a straight answer and didn't feel like walking to the far pasture to find the boss. She was not done. There was more to do. There was always more to do, on a place this size, and she had barely started on the breeding program records, which she suspected had the same kind of accumulated drift as everything else she'd found. And the bunkhouse needed better ventilation before another winter passed, and the relationship with the Milford Supply Depot was costing them more than it should, and she'd been meaning to look into the alternative in the capital. Tonight the snow was falling and the coffee was hot, and the man sitting across from her had chosen her when no one else had thought to, and it turned out that was enough to build something real on, even if it wasn't what the stories said love was supposed to look like. It was better, she thought. In some ways, it was considerably better. Aldrich settled in January. Pressler sent the letter on a Wednesday, worded with the careful dignity of a man trying to make a retreat look like a strategic repositioning, full of phrases about mutual benefit and long-term cooperation between neighboring operations that meant, translated plainly, we looked at the territorial board and we don't like our odds. The settlement, the corrected water allocation, baseline, the 30% reduction Mabel had named in that office, while Aldrich turned his hat in his hands and included a formal acknowledgement of Raven Ridge's prior claim on Henderson, Creek's tributary, documented and filed with the county. Colton read the letter at breakfast and set it on the table next to his coffee cup. It's done, he said. Mabel looked up from the feeding schedule she'd been revising. Pressler's wording in the third paragraph is still trying to preserve a future argument about seasonal variation. Caldwell should note that. Colton picked the letter back up and read the third paragraph again. Put it down. You're right. I'll write to Caldwell this morning. He looked at her across the table for a moment. Can you take a victory for 5 minutes before you find the next problem? Consider this. The seasonal variation clause could cost us water in a dry spring. Could. So it's not really a victory until Caldwell addresses it. Mabel. She looked at him. It's a victory, he said, picked up her coffee. Fine, 5 minutes. He almost smiled. She wrote to Caldwell after breakfast, flagged the seasonal variation language, and received a reply by the following week, confirming he had seen it and was already drafting an addendum. The addendum was accepted. The settlement was finalized. Henderson Creek ran at proper levels through the rest of January and into February without interference, which was the first February in 3 years that Walt Greer didn't spend half his time watching the drumstream boundary for signs of diversion. Walt mentioned this to Mabel on a morning in late February when they were both standing at the creek bank in the cold, checking the water level as part of the routine that had become as automatic as anything else at Raven Ridge. 3 years, he said. Not to her exactly, just to the air, in the way of a man acknowledging something. I know, she said. Colton tried twice to get that settled. Couldn't pin it down. He didn't have the survey records. No. Walt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the water. You want to know something? If you want to tell me? When you first showed up, I thought... He stopped. Started again. I thought he'd lost his mind. Writing to a woman in Duskwater. A woman none of us had ever heard of. He worked his jaw. Thought it was grief making him stupid. She waited. It was wrong, he said. It came out like a stone being moved from a place it had been sitting for a long time. About you, I was wrong. She looked at the water. Thank you, Walt, she said. She kept her voice level because she could tell he needed her to, that what he'd just said had cost him, and any acknowledgement larger than what she had given would embarrass him, and he'd spend the next month pretending he hadn't said it. He nodded once, put his hat on, walked back toward the barn. She stood at the creek for a moment longer and felt something move through her chest that she didn't try to name. It was enough just to feel it. Spring came to Raven Ridge the way it always came to the high country reluctantly, in stages, with setbacks. The snow didn't give up the high pastures until mid-March, and the mud that followed was the kind of mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels and patience with equal indifference. The cattle came out of winter in better condition than they had in years, which was the feeding adjustment paying its first dividend, which Mabel noted in the records, with the particular satisfaction of a person who had argued for something and been right about it. She was in the kitchen on a Thursday morning in late March, working through the spring supply orders when she heard a wagon in the yard. She didn't look up immediately. Wagons came and went at Raven Ridge supply deliveries, neighboring ranchers, hands coming back from time off in town. She had learned to filter out the ordinary sounds of the ranch's traffic. But then she heard a voice. She knew that voice. She set down her pen. Her father was standing in the yard when she came to the door, his hat in his hand, looking at the main house with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now discovering that the reality is larger than what he rehearsed for. Clara was in the wagon seat behind him. Delia was beside her. They both looked cold and tired, and like they had been in that wagon for a long time. Mabel stood on the porch and looked at them. Her father saw her, and something crossed his face relief, she thought, and then quickly after it, the familiar habit of reshaping his own emotions into whatever form would serve him best. He had been doing that her whole life, managing his face the way he managed everything, and she recognized it the way you recognize an old scar. Mabel, he said. Papa. She didn't move from the porch. This is a long way to come without a letter, I thought. He turned his hat in his hands. I thought you might not answer a letter. That was honest, at least. She gave him that. Well, what in, she said. He told her standing in the yard, because she didn't invite him in immediately, which she could see he'd expected and which she let him deal with on his own terms. The story came out in the way her father's stories always came out, with himself at the center, and the circumstances at fault, and the other people in the story making bad choices that led to his current situation, with occasional concessions to his own role that were just large enough to seem like accountability without actually being it. The short version was this: 2 bad seasons, a loan that had seemed manageable, a business arrangement with a Duskwater merchant named Ferris that had turned out to be neither what it appeared nor legal in every particular, and a creditor who had lost patience in January. The Whitmore property, the house, the livestock, the land was gone, had been gone since February. Gerald Whitmore, who had spent his whole life trading on a name that opened doors, had arrived at a door the name couldn't open. He needed money. He needed it from Mabel, which meant he needed it from Raven Ridge, which meant he needed it from Colton Vane, who was not present in the yard because he was riding the upper pastures and didn't know any of this was happening yet. Clara sat in the wagon and didn't speak, which was unusual enough that Mabel looked at her twice. Delia looked at her hands. When her father finished, Mabel was quiet for a moment. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." She put the kettle on. She set cups out. She did these things without hurrying and without speaking, letting the silence work which it did. By the time she set the cups on the table and sat down, her father had lost the performance he'd been maintaining in the yard, and what was left was just an old man who was tired and frightened and not sure what to do with either of those things. Clara sat with her hands around her cup and stared at the table. "It's a good house," Clara said finally, looking around the kitchen with something in her eyes that wasn't quite envy. "Bigger than I thought." "It's a working ranch," Mabel said. "Built for work." Delia looked up. "Are you happy here?" Mabel looked at her younger sister. Delia had her mother's eyes and her father's talent for making questions sound simpler than they were. "Yes," Mabel said, "I am." Delia nodded. She looked back at her hands. It was Clara who said the thing that nobody else was going to say. Clara had always been the one willing to say the thing, which was her only quality Mabel had ever genuinely respected. "We laughed at you," Clara said. "When the letter came, we laughed." She didn't look up. "I keep thinking about that." Mabel held her coffee cup. "I know," she said. "We didn't think—" Clara stopped. "I didn't think you were worth laughing at." "Exactly. I just didn't think you were." She seemed to be searching for words that fit. "I didn't think you were someone things could happen to. Good things." Her voice was flat with the effort of honesty. "I thought you'd always just be there, managing, and we'd be the ones things happened to." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "You were unkind to me my whole life," Mabel said. "Both of you." She said it without heat, just as a fact because it was one. Not because you were cruel by nature. Because I was convenient to be unkind to, and there were no consequences. Neither of them argued with this. "There are consequences now," her father said quietly. He meant his own situation, she knew, but the words sat in the room and covered more ground than he intended. "Yes," she said, "there are." She heard hoofbeats in the yard. A moment later, the kitchen door opened, and Colton came in with cold air and the smell of horseroots and mud, and he stopped when he saw the three people at his kitchen table, and his face went through a quick, careful sequence of assessments that she had learned to read. "My family," she said, "Papa, Clara, Delia." Colton looked at her, not at them. She gave him a small nod that meant, "I'll explain. I'm handling it. It's all right." He hung his coat and his hat and sat down at the table and said nothing while she poured him coffee, and the fact that he trusted her enough to sit quietly while she led a conversation with her own family in his house was not lost on her. She told him the situation plainly, with her family present, which she did deliberately. She did not want her father to have the opportunity to reshape the story in the retelling. When she finished, Colton sat with his coffee and was quiet for a moment. "How much?" he said. Mabel told him the figure her father had named, which was substantial but not impossible. Colton looked at Gerald Whitmore directly. Her father, to his credit, held the look. "I'm not a charity," Colton said, "and I'm not a bank." He paused. "But Mabel is my wife, and you're her family, which means your situation is mine to consider." He set his cup down. "I'll discuss it with Mabel privately. You can have an answer by morning." Her father started to say something, the beginning of a speech. She could tell, something grateful and elaborate. Colton stopped it with a look. "You'll have an answer by morning," he said again. Same tone, no room in it. Her father closed his mouth. Mabel showed them to the spare room and the bunkhouse and came back to the kitchen, where Colton was still sitting with his coffee. She sat across from him. "I don't want to give him money," she said. "I know. He'll lose it. Whatever we give him, he'll make another arrangement with another Ferris and lose it the same way, because he's never had to learn how not to." She looked at her hands on the table. "But he's old, and he's frightened, and Clara and Delia didn't make the bad decisions. They just ended up in them. What do you want to do?" She had been thinking about this since she'd seen the wagon in the yard. She had been thinking hard and fast, the way she thought when a problem had a time constraint, and she had arrived at something that she thought was right even if it was uncomfortable. The small operation on the Milford Road, she said, Brecker property. It's been sitting empty since October. He looked at her. That's 30 acres. A house and a barn. It's enough for a small cattle operation. Not big, but enough to sustain 3 people if they work it. She met his eyes. I want to offer it to them, not give it. I want to lease it to them at a rate they can manage with the understanding that they work it themselves. No more arrangements with merchants. No more borrowing on a name. Colton thought about this. Your father has never actually worked a ranch, he said. He knows enough. And Clara and Delia are more capable than they've ever been allowed to be, because he's always wanted them beautiful and available rather than useful. She paused. He needs a reason to work. He doesn't need money. He's had money and lost it. He needs something to keep. Colton looked at her for a long time. The Brecker property isn't cheap, he said, even at a reduced lease. I know. It'll take capital we were going to put toward the breeding program expansion. I know that, too. She held his eyes. I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it was the right thing. He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the early spring evening was settling into the cold that still came every night, even when the days were warming. All right, he said. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. On one condition, he said. What? You tell him the terms yourself. Clearly. All of it, the lease rate, the expectations. What happens if they fail to work it? He needs to hear it from you, not from me. She understood why. If it came from Colton, her father would spend the rest of his life thinking of it as Colton's arrangement, Colton's charity, Colton's decision. If it came from her, he would have to live with what that meant. He would have to know every morning, when he woke up in a house that his daughter had made possible, exactly who had chosen to help him and why. I'll tell him, she said. She told him the next morning, in the kitchen, before Clara and Delia were awake. She told him everything: the property, the terms, the work that would be expected, the consequences if the lease payments fell behind. She said it clearly and without softness, and watched her father's face move through several things. He sat with it for a moment. You could have just given me money, he said. Could have, she agreed. I didn't. Because you don't trust me with it. Because money won't fix what's actually wrong. She looked at him steadily. You've been a man with a good name his whole life, Papa. You traded on it, and you never built anything behind it. This is a chance to build something. Small. But real, she paused. It's more than you gave me. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically. Her father was not a man for dramatic shifts. But something: I wasn't a good father to you, he said. Came out sounding like it had been stored somewhere for a long time, and he was unsure whether saying it out loud would make it lighter or heavier. No, she said, you weren't. He looked at the table. Your mother would have... He stopped. Don't, she said quietly. Don't use Mama to apologize. She's not here, you are. She waited a moment. Do you want the property or not? He looked up at her. Yes, he said. I want it. She nodded. Then we'll ride out and look at it this week. And you'll meet with Colton and sign the lease papers properly, the same as any other tenant, and I will not have it treated as charity in this family or anywhere else. Is that clear? Yes, he said. That's clear. Clara and Delia took the news differently from each other, which was how they took most news. Clara asked 3 practical questions about the property, the condition of the barn, the water supply, proximity to Milford that suggested she had been thinking about practical things for some time and had perhaps been waiting for someone to give her a reason to. Delia cried a little, which Mabel hadn't expected, and then said she was sorry, which Mabel also hadn't expected. For which part? Mabel asked. All of it, Delia said. The laughing. The way we talked about you. Everything. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I've been thinking about it since we got in the wagon. Since the whole thing fell apart, really. I keep thinking how... She stopped. You were always there. You were always doing things. We just never looked at it. Mabel looked at her sister, 22 years old, sitting in a kitchen she'd never expected to sit in, being honest in a way she'd probably never been required to be. "You can start looking now," Mabel said. "That's not nothing." The Brecker property visit happened on a Saturday, when the mud had dried enough to make the road passable. Mabel rode out with her father and her sisters and Colton, who came along not because he didn't trust her to handle it, but because the property was his to offer, and he wanted to see how her family responded to it. What happened when they got there was something she hadn't fully anticipated. Property was run down, but sound the house needed work. The barn needed new boards on the souths. The fence lines were overgrown in places. Kind of place that looked like neglect, but was really just absence. A property waiting for someone to care about it again. Clara walked the fence lines and said almost nothing. Delia looked at the house and started making a list without being asked. Her father stood in the middle of the yard and turned slowly, looking at the boundaries of the land, the hills to the north, the pasture to the south, and Mabel watched him look at it and saw something in his face that she hadn't seen there before, not once in her life that she could remember. He looked at the land the way a man looks at something he might be able to take care of. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't point it out to Colton or remark on it to her sister. She just let it be, because it was his to feel and not hers to narrate, and because there was enough grace in the moment already without her adding to it. They signed the lease papers at the Raven Ridge kitchen table the following week. Hobson witnessed it, still wearing the impractical hat. Walt Greer had been told, and had expressed his opinion privately to Colton and publicly to no one, which was the most restraint she had ever seen from him, and she appreciated it. Gareth asked her, carefully, while she was reviewing the spring cattle reports, whether it was true that her family was going to be working the Brecker property. "True," she said. "He thought about this. Is that a good thing? For you?" She looked up at him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me in a year." He nodded, satisfied with that. He went back to the water level reports. The weeks that followed had a different texture than anything before them. Her family sat onto the Brecker property with the uneven, stumbling energy of people learning how to do something for the first time while pretending they aren't. Her father made mistakes several, some of them costly in the small way that small operations can't afford to absorb easily. He wrote to her twice, with questions that he framed as requests for information and that were actually requests for help without wanting to call it that, which was progress of a kind, she supposed. She answered both letters. She was precise and useful, and not warm exactly, but not cold either. She was what she had always been for her family, practical. She was just practical now, on her own terms, for her own reasons. Clara, it turned out, had a talent for cattle that nobody had ever thought to discover, because nobody had ever thought to let her try. She wrote in her third letter that she'd caught a calving problem that the local veterinarian had missed, and her tone in describing it had the particular ring of someone's, discovering something about themselves that changes the shape of their life. Mabel read that letter twice. She didn't write back immediately. She sat with it for a while, at the desk in the Raven Ridge office, while the April evening came down outside, and she thought about the shape of things, how a woman can spend her whole life being told who she is and what she's worth, and how long it takes to unlearn it, and how sometimes it takes losing everything before you're free to find out what you actually are. She thought about Clara at a fence line in the early morning, figuring out a problem nobody had trusted her to solve before. Thought about herself 18 months ago, standing in a kitchen in Duskwater with a coat in her hands and a decision she was finally making for herself. Picked up her pen and wrote back. The letter was 2 pages. In it, she told Clara everything she'd learned in her first spring at Raven Ridge about calving, the signs, the timing, the interventions, the things the book said, and the things that were different in practice. She wrote it the way Colton had walked her through the cattle operation. On her second morning, clearly, without condescension, as though she assumed her sister was capable of keeping up. She sealed it and sent it with the next rider to Milford. Colton found her at the desk when he came in that evening and looked at the expression on her face. which was apparently something because he stopped and looked at her for a moment. "Good news?" he said. "Clara caught a calving complication," she said. "She handled it herself." He hung his coat. "Your sister knows cattle work?" "Apparently she does." Mabel looked at the sealed letter on the edge of the desk. She just never had a reason to find out. Colton poured himself coffee and sat in the chair across from her, the chair she'd come to think of as his thinking chair, the one he settled into when the day was done and the work of the mind could begin. "You're not what I thought you'd be," he said. She looked up. "What did you think I'd be?" "Harder," he said. "Given your family. Given how they treated you. I thought you'd come here and want nothing to do with them. Thought you might even enjoy it being the successful one, watching them struggle." He paused. "Didn't. Would you have respected me if I had?" He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she had come to count on him for. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe not." "I don't want them to suffer," she said. "I never did. I wanted them to see me." She paused. "Starting to. It's enough." He looked at her across the desk, in the lamplight, with the evening settling outside, and the ranch breathing in its nighttime rhythms all around them. "You know what Ruth would have said about you," he said. She waited. "She would have said you were exactly right for this place," he said, "and that I was lucky and ought to know it." She felt something move in her chest, quiet and real. "She usually right?" Mabel asked. "About most things," he said. "Nearly all of them." She picked up her pen. She went back to the accounts. He drank his coffee. The lamp burned steadily between them, throwing its small yellow light across the desk, across the ledgers, across the years of work they had already done together, and the years still ahead that neither of them could see yet. But that sat there quietly all the same, patient, waiting to be built. Outside, Henderson Creek ran at full and proper levels, the way it was supposed to, the way it would keep running now that someone had finally paid attention to what had been taken from it. Spring that followed was the best Raven Ridge had seen in years, and everyone who worked the land knew it, even if they didn't say so directly, because frontier people don't generally announce good fortune out loud. They're too aware of how quickly the land can take it back. The calf count came in at the highest number in 6 years. Colton noted it in the records without ceremony, and then went out and checked the count himself, because he was the kind of man who needed to verify good news with his own eyes before he trusted it. He came back in, sat down at the kitchen table, and said, "The feeding adjustment worked." Mabel didn't say, "I told you so." She just poured him coffee and sat across from him and let the number sit between them like something earned. "We should expand the breeding program this fall," she said. "I've been thinking the same thing. Caldwell sent a letter last week. The water's settlement is fully recorded. Aldrich can't revisit it for 10 years without triggering the restitution clause." Good. He wrapped his hands around the cup. "What else?" She had a list. She always had a list. But she'd learned in the months since winter to give him the most important things first and save the rest. For when they were both less tired, which was a small adjustment in how she'd always operated, she used to give everything at once. Because in her family's house, there was never a second chance to be heard. At Raven Ridge, there was always another morning. That had taken some getting used to. "The bunkhouse ventilation," she said. "Before next winter, 2 of the hands had lung problems in January that I think were related to the air quality. Walt mentioned it." "Walt mentioned it to you?" "Last week." He looked at her. "He said you'd been after him about it since December, and he figured if you were still on it, it was probably worth doing." She sat with that for a moment. Walt Greer telling Colton that if Mabel was still on something it was worth doing was, in the language of Walt Greer, approximately equivalent to a public declaration of confidence. She decided not to make anything of it, the same way she'd learned not to make anything of the moment in February, when he'd told her she was wrong about her family. "I'll get a carpenter to look at it in May," she said. "I'll tell Walt." The bunkhouse work got done in May, as she said, by a carpenter from Milford named Tate, who was efficient and quiet and did the work in 4 days without complaint. The ventilation improvement was not dramatic to look at a few additional louvers, a repositioned flue, but the difference in the air quality by summer was noticeable to everyone who slept there. And noticeable things get talked about, and things that get talked about at Raven Ridge generally got traced back to Mabel, eventually, whether she wanted credit for them or not. She didn't particularly want credit. She wanted the problem solved. These were not the same goal, and she had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that other people sometimes needed to see the credit land somewhere in order to trust the next decision, which meant letting the acknowledgement happen even when it made her uncomfortable. She was still imperfect at this. She suspected she always would be. Summer arrived and brought its own demands, the hot, not relentless work of the high season, the long days that started before dawn and ended after dark, particular exhaustion that accumulates in a body that has been doing physical and mental labor simultaneously for months without much pause. She had grown stronger than she'd been in Duskwater, which had been strong enough. Her hands had new calluses in new places. She slept through the night now, most nights, which she hadn't managed reliably since her early 20s. She also, somewhere in the middle of all of it, became genuinely content, not happy in the way the stories described, not full of light and ease and the constant reward of being where you belong. It was earthier than that, more complicated. Some mornings she woke up irritated before she'd even gotten out of bed, and some evenings she and Colton sat at dinner without a word between them for 20 minutes because they'd both used everything up on the work. And there were days in August when the heat made the cattle restless, and the hands short-tempered, and the ranch felt like a machine grinding against itself. And she wondered what she'd thought she was doing out here in the high country with a man she hadn't known a year ago running an operation that could still fail in 100 different ways. But then the evening came, and the temperature dropped, and the sky over the ridge did what it did. At that altitude went purple and gold, and then the deep, clear black of a sky, without any town lights for 20 miles, and she sat on the porch with coffee and felt the day settle out of her, and she knew. She knew in the way you know things that are real, rather than wished for, not with certainty exactly, but with the bone-deep recognition of something fitting. Like a joint that had been slightly out of alignment for years, finally finding its proper position. It didn't announce itself. It just was. Colton came out to the porch one evening in late August and sat in the other chair and didn't say anything for a while, which was normal. Then he said, "My brother is coming." She looked at him. He hadn't mentioned a brother before. She'd known there was family, he'd referred to it in passing, the way people refer to things they don't want to examine too directly, but she hadn't pushed. "When?" she said. "Letter came today. He wants to visit in September with his wife." "How long has it been since you've seen him?" Colton turned his coffee cup in his hands. 4 years. She waited. "We had a disagreement," he said. "About the ranch. About Ruth." He paused. He thought I was handling her illness wrong. Thought I should have taken her to the capital, to the doctors there. I thought. He stopped. "I did what she asked me to do. She didn't want to go. She wanted to be here." He was quiet for a moment. "He's never forgiven me for it." She looked at the ridge line in the darkening sky. "Have you forgiven him for that?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I haven't decided." She didn't tell him what to do. She didn't tell him his brother was right or wrong, or that forgiveness was the correct choice, or that holding on to it was. She just sat with him in the question, because she knew by now that Colton didn't need to be told what to feel. He needed space to arrive at things himself. It was one of the ways they were alike. She'd come to understand. They both needed to arrive. "Tell him to come," she said eventually. "You can figure out the rest when you're looking at him." He thought about it. "All right," he said. His brother's name was Leonard, and he arrived on a Wednesday in the first week of September with his wife Nora, who was a compact, cheerful woman from the Sunflat Flatlands who talked enough for both of them and had eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and who shook Mabel's hand on the porch steps with a grip that said she was used to forming her own opinions and sticking to them. Leonard was shorter than Colton and darker, with the same stillness but deployed differently, where Colton's stillness was the stillness of a man who had made peace with silence. Leonard's was the stillness of a man who was working very hard not to say something. He shook Mabel's hand and looked at her, and she could see him doing what Harlan Aldrich had done, assessing her, recalibrating whatever he'd expected. "You're running the ranch alongside him," Leonard said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "The accounts, too?" "Among other things." He nodded slowly. He looked at Colton. Something passed between the brothers that she couldn't read, some old shorthand, and then it passed, and they went inside. Dinner that first evening was careful in the way of people who have history with each other and aren't sure yet how much of it is safe to touch. Nora carried the conversation with a skill that Mabel recognized as the product of long practice, the particular talent of a woman who has spent years smoothing the surfaces of other people's discomfort. She talked about their farm in the South, their 2 daughters, the crop prices that fall, and asked Mabel about the water rights dispute, with what turned out to be genuine curiosity rather than small talk. "You found the notation in the survey records yourself," Nora said. "Day and a half in the land office," Mabel said. Nora looked at her husband. "That's remarkable." Leonard was looking at his plate. "The ranch seems to be running well," he said. To Colton, not to Mabel, but not in a way that excluded her, just in the direction of where the acknowledgement was going. "Better than it was," Colton said. "Better than it was when Ruth Leonard stopped." The name sat in the room. Colton put down his fork. He didn't do it aggressively. He set it down carefully, the way he set things down when he was managing himself. "You can say her name, Leonard. She's not a wound." Leonard looked up. "I wasn't sure. She was my wife for 7 years. She's part of this place. Saying her name doesn't break anything." He paused. "And Mabel knows about her. I told her myself." Leonard looked at Mabel then, fully, and she held the look. "Told me on my first night here," she said. I asked. She kept her voice even. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary person. I'm sorry you lost her." Something in Leonard's face shifted. The working hard not to say something quality eased slightly. "She was," he said. "She really was." The dinner continued, and it didn't fix 4 years of distance in one evening, because those things never get fixed in an evening. But by the end of it, something had loosened, the way a tight knot loosens when it gets wet still there. Still complicated, but workable in a way it hadn't been before. It was Nora who came to find Mabel the next morning, while Colton and Leonard rode out to the upper pastures together. The first time they'd done that in 4 years, which everyone in the house understood was significant and no one mentioned directly. Nora sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and looked at Mabel with those eyes that missed nothing. "He wrote to us about you," Nora said. "In December, after you filed the water rights claim." Mabel looked at her. "Colton wrote to you? He's not a writer, as I'm sure you know. He wrote 4 sentences. Nora smiled. 4 sentences from Colton Vane is practically a novel. She paused. "He said he'd found someone who saw what needed doing and did it. He said the ranch was in better shape than it had been in years." She looked at her coffee. "He said he was glad she'd come." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "He hadn't written to Leonard since the year after Ruth died," Nora said. "Moke. 2 years of nothing. And then 4 sentences about you. Out of nowhere." She looked up. "I don't know what you've done. Exactly. But whatever it is, thank you." "I haven't done anything that wasn't needed," Mabel said. "It's not what I mean." Nora wrapped her hands around her cup. He was gone for a long time. The grief did something to him, pulled him under, kept him there. I could see it every time we visited, even when he was standing right in front of us. He was somewhere else. She paused. "He's not somewhere else anymore. That's what I mean. Whatever you've done." Mabel looked at the table. She thought about a man who had told her on her first night that he wasn't built for the romantic kind of arrangement. And she thought about how that had been true, and how it also not been the whole truth. And she thought about how those 2 things could exist at the same time, without contradiction. "He's a good man," she said finally. "He just needed someone to work alongside." Nora smiled. "So did you, I think." Mabel picked up her coffee and didn't answer, because Nora was right, and they both knew it, and some things don't need confirmation. Leonard and Colton came back from the upper pastures in the early afternoon. She could tell something had happened between them, not a resolution exactly. not the dramatic reconciliation of people who have been carrying the same grief from different sides and have finally set it down together. It was less than that, but also, in some ways, more. They were talking when they rode in. Not much, but talking. By the time they came into the kitchen for coffee, they were talking about the cattle, the calf count, the breeding program, the South Pasture water situation. And Leonard was asking questions that were not the questions of a man making conversation, but the questions of a man who actually wanted to know the answers. That was something. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Leonard and Nora stayed 4 days. On the last evening, Leonard found Mabel alone in the office, working through the fall supply orders, and knocked on the open door. She looked up. He came in and stood in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands, which was something she'd noticed men did when they had something difficult to say, held their hats like the hat was doing the work of holding them in place. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. Did he when you came here? How was he?" Honestly, she thought about how to answer that. She thought about a man with a financial picture that had been eroding for 3 years, about feed schedules that had never adjusted, about supplier fraud that had been running unchecked because nobody was paying attention to the details, about a bunkhouse with bad ventilation that everyone had learned to live with. He was running on will, she said. This place was held together by the fact that he refused to let it fail, and that's a powerful force, but it's not a sustainable one. She paused. He needed someone to take the other half of the weight. Leonard looked at the floor for a moment. He wouldn't accept help. After Ruth, we both offered, Nora and I. He wouldn't hear it. He didn't need it from family, she said. He needed it from someone who had a stake in it. A real stake. Skin in the game. She met Leonard's eyes. He's proud. You know that better than I do. I know it. He can take help from a partner. He couldn't take it from someone who pitied him. Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's lucky you came." "He wrote me a letter," she said. "Came on my own. The luck is mutual." Something in Leonard's expression, for the first time since he'd arrived, fully relaxed. Almost looked like his brother in that moment. "Fair enough," he said. After they left, the ranch went back to its rhythms, and September turned into October, and October turned toward the cold again, and Mabel found herself at the 1-year mark, 1 year, since she had climbed down from a wagon in this yard, with her own trunk and her own clothes, and a decision she had made for herself without having planned to mark it, without having thought about it consciously, and then suddenly aware of it on an ordinary Tuesday morning, while she was doing an ordinary thing, which was reviewing the winter hay order at the kitchen table. 1 year. She set down her pen. She thought about the woman who had stood in a kitchen in Duskwater with a coat in her hands, and 31 years of being made to feel like a problem behind her. She thought about what that woman had expected not from Raven Ridge specifically, but from anything. She had expected very little, she realized. She had learned to keep her expectations small enough to carry without being crushed by them when they failed, and she had become so practiced at it that she hadn't noticed how small they'd gotten. She thought about what she had now, which was not what she'd expected because she hadn't been able to expect. It hadn't had the vocabulary for it, hadn't had the reference point. A ranch that was genuinely hers to run. A man who told her the truth and listened to her answers and said, "My wife is party to any conversation about this ranch," to men who assumed otherwise. Work that mattered and showed its results. People who trusted her judgment. A sister discovering she was capable of things nobody had thought to let her try. Father who was learning, late and clumsily, what it meant to build something instead of trading on a name. None of it was smooth. None of it was the life the stories had promised or the life her family had predicted for her, which had been no life at all, just a continuation of usefulness in the margins of other people's stories. This was her story. That was the difference. She was inside it, and the difference was everything. And the difference. Colton came in from the morning rounds and poured himself coffee and sat across from her and looked at whatever was on her face. "What?" he said. 1 year, she said. He looked at her. Then he looked at the table, at the hay order paperwork, and something moved in his expression. 1 year, he said. They sat with it for a moment, the two of them, in the kitchen of the house that was both of theirs now, with the morning sounds of the ranch coming through the walls and the winter already feeling its way down from the mountain ridges. You could have gone back, he said. After the first month, you didn't have to stay. I know. Why didn't you? She thought about the honest answer, the real one. Not the one that sounded right, but the one that was actually true. Because for the first time in my life, she said, someone asked me what I thought, and then actually waited for the answer. She looked at him. It's not as small a thing as it sounds. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way he nodded when something landed correctly. No, he said. It's not. He went back to his coffee. She went back to the hay order. The morning continued. What she didn't know yet, what neither of them knew on that ordinary Tuesday, a year in, was that the real test of what they'd built was still coming. Because the frontier is not a place that rewards success by leaving you alone. It is a place that, when it sees something working, sends something harder at it to see if it holds. The harder thing arrived in November. It arrived not as a single event, but as a convergence, the way recall crises usually arrive. Not dramatically, but as several ordinary problems that happen to all become serious at the same time. The first was weather, a storm system that came down from the northern ranges earlier than anyone had seen in a decade, dropping temperatures so fast that the ground froze before the cattle could be moved out of the high pastures. The second was a sickness that moved through the herd in the upper valley faster than Walt's experience said it should, because the stress of the early cold had compromised animals that were otherwise in good condition. The third was a young man named Doyle, who had been with the ranch for 2 years, who was badly injured when a fence post gave way in the frozen ground and pinned him. All three of these things happened within 4 days. Doyle's injury was the most urgent. He was alive and conscious, but his leg was broken in a way that needed more than the frontier medicines available at Raven Ridge, which meant someone needed to ride for a doctor, which took a full day each way, which meant Doyle spent 36 hours in the bunkhouse, with the legs splinted and packed in snow, and the rest of the hands rotating through to sit with him, because nobody at Raven Ridge was leaving an injured man alone, whatever else was happening. Gareth sat with him through the first night. Mabel came in at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. She never slept when something was wrong. It was one of her persistent failures as a person, and found Gareth sitting in the chair by the bunk, looking exhausted and frightened in the way that very young men look frightened when they're confronted with the real cost of the work they've chosen. She sent Gareth to bed. She sat with Doyle herself. Doyle was 24. And from a small settlement in the Eastern Territories, and had never broken anything before, and pain was making him talkative in the loose, unguarded way of a person whose usual defenses have been stripped. He talked about his mother, and a girl in the Eastern settlement, and a dog he'd had as a child, and Mabel listened to all of it without comment, because what she'd learned about sitting with a person in pain was that the listening was the thing, not the responding. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, he said, "You think it'll be all right? The leg?" "I think the doctor will tell us more than I can," she said honestly. "But what do you think?" She looked at him. He needed something, not false comfort, but not despair, either something that was actually honest and actually kind simultaneously, which was the hardest thing to give because it required you to be both at once. "I think you're young and you're strong and the break is clean," she said. "I think those things matter. I also think we won't know until we know, and sitting here cataloging everything that could go wrong won't change the outcome, so we might as well not do that." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not exactly encouraging." "No," she agreed. "But it's true. I think I like true better," he said, "even when it's not encouraging." "Most people do," she said. "They just don't always know it." He fell asleep around 5. She sat until dawn, and then she went to find Colton. Cattle's situation was the more complex problem, in the way that the problems you can't fix immediately are always more complex than the ones with clear solutions. The sickness moving through the upper valley herd was respiratory, not unusual in a cold snap, especially in animals that had been stressed. But the speed of it was wrong, faster than it should have been, which Walt said meant either the animals were weaker than their condition suggested, or the pathogen was something they hadn't seen in this form before. Colton and Walt debated it at the fence line of the upper pasture, while the infected animals were moved to separate ground, and the rest of the herd was pushed south, where the cold was marginally less brutal. Mabel had been reading. In October, before any of this, she had found a veterinary text in the back of the Milford Supply Depot, an actual published text, not a pamphlet, from an Eastern university, only 2 years old, and she had bought it for 30 cents and read it in her evenings over the course of 3 weeks. It had seemed theoretical at the time, the kind of knowledge you store without knowing when you'll use it. She pulled it out now from where she'd shelved it in the office and went through the respiratory illness section with the symptoms Gareth had described from his time monitoring the herd. She found something on page 214. She went to the upper pasture fence line and told Colton and Walt what she'd found, which was a description of a cold stress respiratory syndrome that moved faster than standard winter respiratory illness in cattle that were nutritionally adequate but had experienced rapid temperature shock, and which responded to a specific treatment protocol that was different from what Walt had been planning to do. Walt read the page she showed him. He read it twice. He looked at the herd and looked at the text and looked at Mabel. "Where did you get this book?" he said. "Milford, in October." "Why?" "Because it existed and I hadn't read it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then the protocol. We'd need to get supplies from Duskwater. I made a list." She handed it to him. "Gareth can ride this morning if he goes now." Walt took the list. He looked at it. He looked at the text again. "This might not work," he said. "It might not," she agreed. "But the standard protocol for this progression rate has a poor outcome record." Page 217. He found the page. He read it. His jaw shifted. "I'll send Gareth," he said. Gareth rode to Duskwater and back in one day, which was fast enough that he came back with his horse blown and himself not far behind, and he handed the supplies to Walt with the wordless determination of someone who understood what they were carrying. The treatment started the following morning, applied to the most severely affected animals first, and for 2 days nothing was certain. The sick cattle either got better or they didn't, and there was nothing to do but watch and repeat the treatment, and wait, which was the hardest part of any crisis, the part where you've done what you can do, and the outcome is no longer in your hands. Mabel kept working. She visited Doyle in the bunkhouse twice a day. She managed the supply deliveries that kept arriving regardless of the emergency. She wrote to Clara about the situation, not for advice, but because she had started writing to Clara regularly, and it had become, without either of them planning it, one of the steadier things in her life. Clara's letters back were practical, and increasingly confident, the voice of a woman who was learning what she was made of and liked what she found. On the 3rd day after treatment began, Walt came to the office door. He stood there for a moment. 11 of the 14 affected animals are showing improvement, he said. Strong improvement. The other 3 paused. We'll lose those, but the rest look like they're going to be all right. Mabel set down her pen. The text was right, she said. The text was right. He was quiet for a second. Then, "I've been running cattle operations for 28 years, and I hadn't read that book." "It's 2 years old," she said. "You can't read everything." "No." He looked at her. "But you can read more than I have been." He said it the way he said things that cost him flatly, without decoration, because he wasn't built for decoration, and the flatness was what made it genuine. "I'm going to ask you to put together a list. Books, texts, things I should know about that I might not." She looked at him. "That's not a thing you ask most people for," she said. "You're not most people," he said. And he left before she could respond, which she thought was probably intentional and also probably the most Walt Greer thing he had ever done. The doctor arrived on the 4th day and set Doyle's leg properly and told him he'd be off it for 6 weeks. and on it cautiously for another 6 after that, which Doyle accepted with the resigned practicality of a young man who has realized that his body has a vote. He spent his recovery in the bunkhouse, and Mabel had Gareth bring him the veterinary text to read. Once she was done with it, which Doyle received with the expression of a man who had not expected to be given a book, but was willing to try, he returned it 2 weeks later and said it was more interesting than he'd expected, which, she thought, was probably the beginning of something. The winter that followed was hard, but not catastrophic, which was the best you could say about high country winters. The hay stores held. The herd came through in better condition than any of the previous 3 years, even accounting for the losses from the November illness. Henderson Creek ran without interference. The bunkhouse stayed warmer and cleaner than it ever had, and the hands noticed, and noticing things at Raven Ridge had a way of getting attributed correctly now. January brought a letter from Caldwell that settled the final water rights accounting. Aldrich paid the restitution figure, which was significant, and which Colton signed over partially to ranch improvements, and partially to a reserve fund that Mabel had been arguing for since October, the kind of fund that could absorb a bad season without forcing desperate decisions. "You've been wanting this reserve since the beginning," Colton said when the money was deposited. "Since I looked at the 3-year accounts and saw how close things had been in the bad seasons," she said. "A ranch this size shouldn't be 1 bad year away from serious trouble. It won't be anymore." "No," she agreed. "It won't." He looked at the ledger where she'd recorded the deposit. "What do you want to do with the breeding program expansion?" "We have the capital now." She had a plan. She'd been developing it since summer, refining it based on the fall calf count and the veterinary text, and 2 letters from a cattle breeding specialist in the Eastern Territories, whose name she'd found in the bibliography of the veterinary book, and to whom she had written, on a reasonable guess, asking about bloodline improvement strategies for high country operations. The specialist, a woman named Dr. Reese, had written back 3 pages of detailed technical response that Mabel had read 6 times, and the 2 of them had been corresponding since November. She put the plan on the desk. Colton read through it. He asked 4 questions, all of them good ones, and she answered all 4 with specifics because she had anticipated all 4. When he finished, he set the papers down. "Dr. Reese is a woman," he said. "Yes. You didn't mention that. I didn't think it was relevant to the quality of her breeding program analysis." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "No, suppose it's not." He looked at the plan again. "If we start in spring with the first bloodline acquisition, we'll see the results in the fall calf count 2 years from now," she said. "It's not a fast improvement, but it's the right one." "All right." He pulled the papers toward him. "I'll write to the supplier. I already contacted him," she said. He stopped. "Before I brought it to you," she said, "I wanted to know if the bloodlines we need were available, and at what price. They are, and the price is within the plan's budget." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know," he said, "at some point I'm going to get used to that. Is that a problem?" "No," he said, "it's the opposite of a problem." She took the papers back and went to the desk and started drafting the formal order. And he went to the window and looked out at the January ranch, at the white hillsides, and the distant dark shapes of the herd against the snow. Operation they had built together out of what had already been good and what had been lacking, and the particular combination who were cognizant of 2 people who were honest with each other, even when it was uncomfortable. The second sling spring came the way the first had, reluctantly and in stages. The mud returned. The calves came. The high pastures opened up on the schedule. Mabel had restructured, which meant the cattle reached fresh grass at the right time and in the right condition, and the difference in their summer weight gain was measurable and was measured. Her father wrote in April. The letter was shorter than his letters usually were, which meant he'd worked hard on it, he said. The Brecker property had made it through winter. He said they'd lost 2 calves in the hard cold in February, but saved 4 that they'd expected to lose, which Clara had managed. He said Delia had taken over the accounts and had found an error in the loss calculation that was actually in his favor a small thing, but she'd found it and told him about it rather than keeping it, which he seemed to regard as noteworthy. He said he was tired, in a way he hadn't been tired before, a different kind of tired, and that he was starting to understand the difference between the fatigue of worry and the fatigue of work. At the end of the letter, he said, "I think about what you said, that I gave you a chance to build something real. I'm trying to understand what that means for myself. I don't know yet, but I'm trying." She read it twice, and then folded it and put it in the box where she kept correspondence that mattered, which was a battered wooden box from the Duskwater General Store that had once held nails and now held the letters she'd collected in her time at Raven Ridge, from Clara, from Caldwell, from Dr. Reese, from Nora, from her father, C, from a handful of others. She ran her hand across the top of the box for a moment and then went back to work. She wrote back to him that evening. 2 pages. She told him about the spring calf count and the water levels and the breeding program she was starting. She told him about Doyle's leg, which had healed cleanly, and which Doyle was using with the slightly exaggerated carefulness of someone who is newly aware of their own fragility. She told him about Walt Greer asking her for a reading list, which she had now provided, and which Walt was working through with the methodical determination of a man who has decided to do something and sees no reason to do it any other way. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "Trying is not nothing, Papa. It's actually most of it." She sealed it and sent it. In May, Colton's brother Leonard wrote to say that Nora was expecting their 3rd child, and that if it was a girl, they were thinking of a name. He wrote the name and then wrote, "Nora says," to tell Mabel it was her idea. The name was Ruth. Colton read the letter at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. She didn't ask him what he was thinking. She got up and put the kettle on and made mock coffee and set the cup in front of him and went back to her chair and picked up her work again. After a while, he said, "That's a good thing." "Yes," she said. "It is." Put the letter down and picked up his coffee. And that was that. Except that it wasn't. Because some things don't have an, except that some things are just exactly as good as they seem. And the not pressing further is its own kind of grace. The summer of the 2nd year was longer and hotter than the first had been, and the work was heavier because the ranch was bigger now, the breeding program adding complexity, the operation demanding more of everyone at every level. Mabel ran on 4 hours of sleep some nights and caught herself in the office at midnight twice, working through projections for the fall market that could have waited until morning, but that her mind wouldn't let go of. On one of those midnights, Colton appeared in the office doorway and looked at her. "Bed," he said. "I'm almost Mabel." She looked up. "Projections will be the same numbers in the morning," he said. Put down her pen. He was right, which she resented in the mild, fond way that you resent things that are true and inconvenient. "Can't turn it off," she said. "I never could, I know." He leaned against the doorframe. "Neither can I. But you stop eating when you're deep in something, and you stopped eating today at noon, and you need to sleep." She looked at him. "You noticed I didn't eat." "I notice most things," he said. "Just don't always say them." She sat back in her chair and looked at the man in the doorway, 3 years older than her, quieter than the world thought men were supposed to be, bad at sentiment, but honest enough that it didn't matter. Person who had written her name in a letter before he knew what she was, and had turned out to be right about what she was in ways neither of them had expected. She thought about what her sister had said a year ago, sitting in this kitchen for the first time. "Are you happy here?" She had said yes. She had meant it. She still meant it. But she understood it better now than she had then understood, that it wasn't happiness in the simple sense, the feeling good sense, but happiness in the structural sense, the kind that holds up under weight, kind that's there on the bad days as well as the good ones, not as a feeling but as a fact. "All right," she said. She closed the ledger. He waited for her and walked down the hall with her, and said good night at the door of their room. They had been sharing a room since January, a practical development that had shifted gradually into something else, something neither of them had named directly, because they were both people who understood that some things don't need naming, and she went to sleep and didn't wake until morning. In the morning, the projections were the same numbers. She finished them in an hour. The second fall calf count came in on an October morning that smelled of frost and wood smoke, and the particular sharpness of the high country at the beginning of its long turn inward. Gareth brought the numbers to the office and put them on the desk, and stood there with the look of someone who knows the news is good and can't quite contain it. She looked at the numbers. She looked at them again. "Is this right?" she said. "Counted 3 times," Gareth said. "Me and Walt both." The count was the highest in the ranch's recorded history, not by a little. The breeding program changes had added to a herd that was already in better condition than it had been in years, and the combination was a number that she had projected as the best-case outcome and had privately expected to not quite reach. She sat with it for a moment. "Tell Colton," she said. "Tell Walt, tell him. The breeding program projections are looking accurate." Gareth went. She stayed at the desk with the numbers on the paper in front of her and let herself feel it, really feel it, not just note it and move to the next thing, which was her habit and her flaw. She let it sit in her chest and be what it was, the result of 2 years of paying attention when nobody was paying enough attention. 2 years of doing what she'd always been capable of doing, finally on ground where it counted. She thought about a letter and a kitchen table, and a father who had read a name out loud and laughed. She thought about the woman who had heard that laughter and gotten angry, the right kind of angry, the quiet, load-bearing kind, and made a decision. She thought, look where that decision went. Walt came to the office an hour later, ahead of Colton, and stood in the doorway with the calf count report in his hand. "The breeding changes," he said. "Mostly," she said. "And 2 years of better condition going into breeding season. And the feeding adjustment, that was year 1. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. "I've been at this ranch for 17 years, he said. "This is the best count I've seen." She met his eyes. "What do you want to do with it?" He blinked. "What?" "The number. What do you want to do with it? We can hold more animals through winter now, or we can sell the overage at this fall's market prices, which are good. What's your read?" He was quiet for a second, and she could see him adjusting to being asked, which was still something he was working on, the being asked, rather than being told or being overruled, getting better at it, the way careful people get better at things, slowly, with occasional retreats to old habits, but on a clear trajectory. "Sell 60 of the overage," he said. "Hold the rest. Market prices are good now, but next fall could be better, and if the breeding program holds, then the next count is even higher, and we have a larger operating herd." "My read. Mine too," she said. "Tell Colton." He nodded. He started to go. He stopped. "Mrs. Vane," he said. She looked up. He almost never called her that. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I said it before, but—" He seemed to be deciding how much further to go. "I want to say it again. Because the first time I said it at a creek bank, and you let it pass, which was the right thing. But you should know I meant it." She looked at him steadily. "I know you did, Walt," she said. "I've always known." He nodded once, put his hat on, left. Colton came in 10 minutes later, and she showed him the numbers, and he read them without speaking, and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Oh, the way he did when something hit him hard, and he was sorting it. "Ruth would have been proud of this," he said. It came out quietly, simply, without any of the careful management she sometimes heard when he talked about her. "I think she would have been happy for you," Mabel said, "which is a different thing." He looked at her. "You think those are different?" "Pride is about the achievement," she said. "Happiness is about the person. I think she'd have been both, but the happiness would have been bigger." He was quiet for a moment. "You're probably right." "I'm often right," she said. "It's one of my more tolerable qualities." He looked at her with the expression that had replaced the almost smile over the course of the year, not quite a full smile, but more than the earlier version, the kind of expression that had enough warmth in it to be unmistakable. "It's one of your better ones," he said. She went back to the ledger. He stayed in the chair and looked at the calf count report, and they sat together in the good news the way they sat together, in the hard news and the ordinary news side by side, doing the next thing, which was all that the frontier had ever asked of anyone. October wound down, and November came in with its cold, and the ranch prepared for winter with the particular efficiency of an operation that has done this before and knows where the weaknesses are and has addressed them. The hay stores were at the right level. The bunkhouse was warm. The water rights were documented and defended. The herd was in the best condition of Colton's ownership. The books were clean. On a Thursday evening in the first week of November, Mabel sat on the porch in her heavy coat with her coffee going cold in her hands, watching the early dark come down over the ridge. Stars were already out at that altitude. They came early and brilliant. The kind of sky that people who grew up in towns never quite got used to because it was too large and too literal. All that vast dark with all those points of light, no way to look at it without feeling the size of it. She sat and looked at the size of it. She thought about who she was. Not in the anxious way she'd done most of her life. Not what am I worth? What am I allowed to take up? What will they think, but plainly, the way you think about facts. She was 33 years old. She was a rancher. She was a woman who had read enough veterinary texts to help save 14 cattle from a respiratory syndrome that nobody had seen in that form before, and who had found a survey notation in a dusty territorial land office that ended a 3-year water dispute, and who had turned her father from a creditor with a bad reputation into a man who was learning, at 61, what it meant to build something, and who wrote to her now not for money, but because he'd run into something he didn't know how to handle. And she was the person he thought of. She was a woman who sat in an office she shared equally with the man she'd married, doing work that mattered, alongside people who had started by not trusting her and had arrived, through evidence rather than sentiment, at something better than trust. She was Mabel Vane. She was not the woman her family had seen when they read that letter aloud and laughed. She had not become this woman. She had always been this woman. That was the thing she had finally understood, not in a single revelatory moment, but in the accumulation of 2 years of being exactly who she was, in a place that let her be it. The woman who could do these things had always existed. What had changed was the ground she was standing on. That was what she wanted to tell every woman who had ever been laughed at, overlooked, reduced to the margins of someone else's story. It's not about becoming. You already are. It's about finding the ground that holds the weight of what you actually are, rather than what other people need you to be. She didn't know how to say that to anyone exactly. She didn't have the gift of speeches or the patience for proclamations. She was a woman who showed rather than told, who communicated through ledgers and water rights filings and veterinary texts left on a young man's bunkhouse bunk, through accurate numbers and honest conversations, and a list of books handed to a skeptical man who needed them. That was her language. That was how she said it. The door opened behind her, and Colton came out with his own coffee and sat in the chair beside her, and they looked at the sky together, in the comfortable silence of two people who have run out of things they need to prove to each other. After a while he said, "Good winter coming." "Probably," she said. "Better prepared than last year." Yes. The stars continued to accumulate overhead, the way they always did at altitude, slowly at first, and then all at once, until the whole sky was thick with them and the ridge was a dark line at the edge of all that light. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered the question. "That I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, "and that I got here by making one decision myself, instead of waiting for someone to make it for me." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good thing to think about." "I know." They sat until the cold got serious about asking them to come in, and then they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds, the cattle in the lower pasture, the creek running at its proper level, the wind working its way through the fence posts, the bunkhouse going quiet as the hands finished their day. Inside the main house, the lamp was burning in the office. where the ledgers were open to the October entries and the calf count report was filed at the front of the record book, and the winter supply orders were drafted and ready to send. The walls held the evidence of 2 years of work, not trophies, not decorations, just the working documents of an operation running well, the paperwork of a life that was building something. Mabel Vane, who had once stood in a kitchen with a coat in her hands, and 31 years of being made small behind her, had done this, had sat in the record rooms, had argued for the reserve fund, had found the survey notation, had bought the veterinary text for 30 cents in a supply depot because it existed and she hadn't read it, had written to Dr. Reese on a reasonable guess, had drafted the water rights claim, had told her father the truth, had told Walt Greer the truth, had told Colton Vane the truth on the very first night, in the doorway of her room, because she had decided she was done starting new things with anything less than honesty. She had done it without being asked and without waiting for permission, the way she had always been capable of doing it, on ground that finally held her weight. Outside, Henderson Creek ran in the dark, steady and full, and exactly where it was supposed to be. That was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was everything.